が私がいたら困るわけ？まさか兄ちゃん。ほほん。兄上、そういうの朝っぱらからはよろしくないとカヤは思います。
そういう冗談ははしたないぞ。兄は悲しい。
ごめんなさい。でも冗談のつもりじゃ。
So I'm just going to say this up front. I think out of all of the Fate series spin-off games, that Fate Samurai Remnant is by far the most enjoyable one that I've played so far, and that is both on the basis of the gameplay and the storytelling. I was given a copy of the game early by Koei Tecmo and spent the past couple of days completing a first playthrough. There are a total of 6 chapters in the game, and while they asked that information and videos from the final chapter not be shown, I'm only going to use things from up till the 4th chapter. I won't be going into specifics about character stories or plots, but I will be speaking about some of the characters that I really liked. I think the first thing that people wonder about with this game is if it's a Muso game, and honestly, I have no clue if you'd consider it one or not. The only game I've played that's considered a Muso game is Fate Extella and Extella Link, and this game plays so differently from both of those that if I had to say whether it's a Muso game based on that, I would say no. But I'm no expert in those type of games. Starting with a quick overview, the game follows Miyamoto Iori, who is shown to be a disciple of the male Musashi in this world, as they go through another rip-off Holy Grail War. This one is called the Waxing Moon Ritual. In this version, there are 15 servants summoned, the normal 7 classes, and then rogue versions of those 7, which do not have masters, as well as a ruler. And so it starts with Iori being attacked at night and somehow managing to summon Saber, and then being pulled into this knockoff Holy Grail War. As a side note, when I first saw that there were 2 servants for each class, I was reminded of Fate Apocrypha. And surprise, Yuichiro Higashide, the writer of Fate Apocrypha, is actually a writer on this game, though I think that their second attempt of having 2 sets of servants plays out way better than the first. Now this is very much a Fate story. You have the calm segments where Iori and Saber are moving around the town, learning information, and doing smaller objectives, which then builds up into more complex and action-packed scenes where they are fighting enemy servants and masters and other things. The way it played out feels much closer to Fate Stay Night than the more recent entries in the Fate franchise, especially Extella and Extella Link. It's nothing similar to those in how the story plays out, and very different from what we've seen in Fate Grand Order recently. I think this is a huge positive because while I really enjoy the story of Fate Grand Order, its complexity and length is kind of daunting, where Samurai Remnant is very self-contained. And aside from Musashi, it doesn't really rely on you knowing the extended Fate lore, but it definitely helps. And while most of the time the story focuses on Iori and Saber, there are a couple of characters that you do get to spend an extended amount of time with.
はいはい、そこまで。話を戻すよ。吉原に攻め込んできたマスターが、ひとまずお互い様子見で手を打ちたいとのたまった。まあ、顔見知りと気づいたってことなら、そりゃ無理はないけどね。わざわざ攻め込んできといてそれってのは、あんまり都合が良すぎやしないかい?
I think one of the more interesting side characters, and one that comes up a lot, is Iori's sister Kaya, who seems to think that Saber is Iori's new live-in girlfriend or prospective wife, and after she learns of the situation, she stays with Iori and Saber in order to help her at the base and take care of the two. I actually enjoyed her segments a lot more than I expected, considering little sister characters are normally kind of annoying. For Masters, we have Zhen Shengon and his servant Archer. You get to spend quite a lot of time with both of them during the game, and they even have segments where you get to control and play as the two during flashbacks and other story events. They're a fun pair and fill somewhat of a mentor role to Iori, who lacks information on how the Waxing Moon Ritual and Holy Grail Wars work as a whole, and kind of teach him how to act as a master in some ways. And then there's Takao Dayu, whose servant is Musashi. I don't know if it was just the choices I made during the game or if they were very memorable, but I feel like outside of Iori and Saber, the character you spend the most time playing as is Musashi. And since Musashi already is an established character, and I think most people who play this game are going to be familiar with her, this pairing usually focuses on Dayu and her overcoming and resolving her issues. As a side note about Musashi, there's a running gag through the whole game where Musashi will use modern lingo or English words and the people around her have no clue what she's talking about. It's a funny bit, but the localization around it gets weird sometimes. For example, at one point, Musashi uses the word escort, but they have the text say chaperone. It's strange to hear her say an English word, but it doesn't match the written text. This happens a couple other times, such as the word cute. It's a little bit nitpicky, but actually it's the only weird thing about the text or localization in the game. Aside from that, I had no issues with the localization or the text or dialogue. Aside from them, the other Master Servant pairs are ones you don't really play as outside of a few short segments. Without going into the story, I think that Yui and their servant Ryder are the most interesting out of the bunch, though Chiemon and his servant Lancer are compelling and mysterious, and throughout this story, every interaction with them made me want to learn more about their situation.
はぐれのサーバントだな。
さてね。
As I mentioned before, the Waxing Moon ritual has 15 servants, and 7 of those are rogue servants. There's a clear distinction between those that are clearly guest characters and those that are important to the game and plot. Assassin, Lancer, Archer, and Caster to some extent really have very little impact on the story as a whole, where the others, Rogue Berserker, Rogue Saber, and Tamamo Aria, are far more integrated into the story. I think this was to be expected though, since with so many servants not everyone can be important to the cast, and the extra rogue servants give us some combat variety and different gameplay. In the end, as far as the story is concerned, I really enjoyed how it played out, and the build up to the finale is very exciting. Though after a first playthrough there's still quite a few questions that I have, as some characters are not fully explained, and it's certainly driving me to do a second playthrough in order to see everything. And as a longtime Fate fan, the story has exactly what I was looking for. It's the compelling relationship built between Iori and Saber, interesting masters and servants, all while following a somewhat familiar structure of Grail War, yet not being identical to the things or the ones we've seen in the past exactly. I'm not sure exactly how to describe it, but when playing I get a sort of nostalgic feeling, the feeling of this is Fate. It reminded me of more of the original Fate Stay Night than anything else, and I really appreciated that. Moving away from the story and characters and onto the gameplay, this is by far the best gameplay we've ever had from a Fate spin-off. Fate Extra and CCC are just rock, paper, scissors simulators, so they're not very exciting gameplay-wise. And Extella is unfun to play, and Extella Link is certainly okay. I had a lot of issues with the way the game actually played out, and it felt very tedious. Fate Samurai Remnant, on the other hand, is actually really fun to play through, and I really enjoyed the combat. There are a lot of different variations to how combat is handled, but there are 5 that stand out the most. First is Iori against humans. In these fights you feel mostly on par with the enemies. You end up attacking, dodging, riposting, and stance changing. There are usually 1 or 2 main enemies with HP bars that you have to take down. These fights are often rather simple, and I think you'd be hard-pressed to lose them. They're great for trying things out though and learning the game. After that is Iori against magical beasts. These are structured the same as humans, except this time the main enemies have what is called a shell. This is basically a magical shield. You do no damage while the shell is up, but the shell can be damaged by magic attacks and skills, as well as normal attacks during brief periods of vulnerability after the enemy attacks. You can also do damage to the shell by doing a riposte, which will then leave them in a vulnerable state for a brief period of time. Then, Iori against servants are the most difficult fights. These are similar to fights against magical beasts, where they have a shell that you have to break through before you can damage them, but they trade having other trash mobs around them for being way more aggressive and powerful. These fights are by far the most exciting parts of the game though. Being able to dodge and riposte is far more valuable here than in any other situation. The shell also regenerates on servants, which really just boils down to a phase 2 of most fights, where you have to break the shell again in order to do damage and win the fight. Aside from the fights against Rogue Archer, who are just annoying to fight, I think that all of them are enjoyable, and by far Ryder and Musashi are the highlights of the game. Then we have servants against humans or magical beasts. These are basically the same as Iori against humans, or sometimes even easier. Servants against humans just mow them down, and it's not even a contest. I've gone into some fights, pressed a single skill, and wiped out everyone. Magical beasts aren't much harder, since servants do massive damage to shell and can easily break them. And finally, there's servants against servants. These fights are usually not difficult per se, but they're more set pieces for the story. They're certainly more challenging than servants versus humans, but both sides are on equal footing, though oftentimes you find yourself being thrust in control of a character you're not familiar with and you have to learn them quickly. The best of these are when you are controlling Musashi though, as outside of Saber, she is the one you end up controlling the most often and therefore the most familiar with. Iori is the one you play most of the game through though, and he has 5 different forms you can play with. There's Earth Stance, which is a slower single sword form, but it does have a block and a counter. This is the one I used the least throughout my playthrough, and I actually only successfully did a counter once on the final boss. Then Water Stance. This is the form I used mostly through the early parts of the game. This is a fast attack with 2 swords, and it has good AoE. When fighting magical beasts or servants after breaking the shell, I would often switch to this in order to finish them off. The attacks being fast mean you're not locked into animations for very long, which makes dodging easier, and I do think it's the stance that's the easiest to learn the game with. Later in the game, you unlock Wind Stance. Now this one caught me off guard. When I first got it and started using it, I found it awkward and pretty bad. But as the game progressed, it actually ended up being my most used stance. That's because Wind Stance is more magically oriented than the other stances, and magic is what does the most damage to Shell. While most attacks against servants or magical beasts just bounce off when they're not in a vulnerable state, Wind Stance attacks can land and damage the shell. It also has ranged attacks that you can fire off in order to weaken the shell. By leveling up the Wind Stance in the skill tree, you can increase the amount of times you can fire off that magic. So while it's a bit clunky to use against humans, it's actually really great against servants. And it may sound like it's your only option for them, but you can actually focus on things such as counters and riposts, as well as magic and servant skills in order to break the shell instead of relying on the Wind Stance. A bit later after that, you gain access to the fourth and what looks like the final stance, which is Fire Stance. This stance gets faster and does more damage the lower your HP. It's a high risk, high reward type stance. Though its damage is actually pretty good even when you're not at low HP, and as the game progressed, I would end up using Wind Stance to break the shell and then Fire Stance to do damage to enemies. I would also use Fire Stance when fighting humans, as just in general it worked really well against them. Finally, there's the fifth stance that you get access to late in the game. This stance is the opposite of the Fire Stance, where the lower your HP is, the greater delay between attacks are. It's a flashy stance that's good for AoE, but against servants or bosses, I didn't find it too useful. Maybe it was a skill issue, as keeping max HP was a bit of a challenge at times, but it's also somewhat hard to track the attacks in this stance. It's visually very busy. As far as the other parts of combat are concerned, Iori has access to spells. To use these, he consumes gems, which can be bought in shops, crafted, or acquired in combat. There are various spells that range from increasing your gauge gain, increasing your damage to shell, attacks, as well as healing. You can also, after some time, switch over to the servant accompanying you. When you control the servant, you are able to use their combos to do greater damage to the enemy or assist with breaking the shell. There are some fights where I spend the entire time to break half of the shell gauge, and at that point Saber was available to switch to, who in the limited time you can control them was able to break the other half. You then also have access to the affinity gauge, which starts off with 3 charges, but by leveling it up through a skill tree you can expand it to more charges. These are used for combo attacks with Saber or other servants that you have with you. These skills often do massive damage to shell as well as stun the opponent. There's one servant though who works differently than the others, and this was actually my preferred support servant during my playthrough, and that's Tamamo Aria.
だって愛というのは一つ屋根の下で育むものなのでしょう。私がいおり様と共に暮らすのもおかしなことじゃありませんわよね。
いや、おかしい。却下だ、却下。
Tamamo Aria cannot be switched into like the other servants, and she does not have any attacks that hit enemies for damage. Instead, she has access to a skill called Malediction Bright Sunshine. What this does is it charms all the enemies around Iori and then buffs Iori greatly. This allows him to go head to head with servants easier without relying on doing combos with servants or changing characters. I know this probably wasn't optimal, and maybe I could have tried out other characters, but I just really enjoyed how Aria worked out, so I ended using them for a vast majority of the game. Though you also lose access to another Noble Phantasm because she does not have one. Speaking of Noble Phantasms, there's an MP bar at the bottom of the screen that fills up as you fight, and once it's full, Iori is able to do a special attack. This attack does a lot of damage to all the enemies on the screen, as well as large damage to shell, and stuns enemies. You later, through the skill tree, get access to expanding that bar, allowing you to hold 2 charges at once. Servants also have access to this as well, but their MP bar only can hold a single charge, though it's very hard to fill up naturally multiple times in a fight anyway, so it's not much of a concern. Because of this slow charge time, most of the servants have access to a skill that is actually a 75% NP battery. This consumes 3 charges in the affinity gauge, which is far easier to fill up, and you can even force fill it up with consumables. An interesting thing about the NP battery is that it's actually an iframe. I presume this is true for all skills, as you become invulnerable to damage during skill animations, but the batteries are just them standing there and buffing up. At one point I actually did use this to dodge an attack. It's almost pointless, but it's an interesting note nonetheless. Aside from that, there are lots of small things you can do outside of combat. There are small side missions to complete over time, and you just collect the rewards. You can level up the workshop to get additional benefits. You can do sword maintenance in order to increase your combat experience, and you can go around and pet all the cats and dogs in town. Early on in the game, petting cats and dogs is actually very helpful, as you actually regenerate a small amount of HP by petting them. So when you don't have a lot of healing items, it can actually make a difference. The last thing I wanted to talk about is the part of the game that strikes fear into all FGO players' hearts, and that's the part that looks like a grail front. In the story, there are times, and actually a lot of times, where you have to connect to the ley lines of the area in order to build up power to break through into another area being held by either a servant or a master or someone else. You start at a single point, usually a Saksa, where your base is located, and from there you move along an area to capture points along the ley lines. In doing so, you sometimes run into enemies that are moving along them as well, and you have to fight them. Though you don't always have to fight. If you cut off an enemy's connection to their starting ley line, they are simply defeated automatically, so you can avoid a lot of fights simply by capturing the right places. When you capture a point that is the territory of a rogue servant, they can also join you on the board and move around, taking spaces and fighting enemies. When they run into enemies, you get to control them as well, and they usually just wipe the floor with human enemies. The exception to this is Tamamo Aria. When you capture her space, instead of joining you for combat, she grants Iori an additional movement per turn. Later in the game, you get access to split off from Saber, so you can actually end up having 3 or 4 different people moving around the map at the same time. You don't actually have to control them individually either. They simply go around and capture spaces. You can direct them, but the game kind of respects your time enough not to make you have to micromanage them. You also gain access to different mystic codes. These allow you to warp around to your connected ley lines, stop enemies from moving, increase your movements per turn, or even capture the surrounding areas. They can be crafted, but honestly I never found myself wanting more than what I had, and I just focused on moving around the board and finding them naturally. Once you reach your destination on the board, you enter an area like any other combat area, but it's actually just the full area for the game. You're able to move around, go to shops if it's a town, pet the dogs, and advance the story in that area. In the end, the leyline mechanic is just a way to have your character fight from one story location to the next, but I found it enjoyable and I think it helped mix things up through the game, so you weren't doing just a single one thing too many times in a row. Overall, I really enjoyed Samurai Remnant. It's by far the best Fate spin-off game we've had on PC and consoles. I'm not going to get into comparing it to Fate Grand Order, as those are absolutely different. So while Fate Extella and Extella Link are fun games, I wouldn't call them good. I like them because of the characters and the story, as well as just my general investment in the Fate franchise, but I actually think that Samurai Remnant is a good game. I actually had fun with the gameplay and enjoyed the combat. On top of that, the story had the feeling of a Fate story, and it had the emotion of one too. I don't know what a person who has no clue what the Fate franchise is would get out of this game, but I think that if you are in any way interested in or a fan of the Fate franchise, this game is 100% worth a playthrough. This video is titled The Nostalgic Feeling of Fate because the game really does remind me a lot of the feelings I got from early Fate. The way the characters interact with each other, the way the story unfolds, how it escalates, and how you get invested in the characters. It's very hard to put into words sometimes, but there were a lot of moments that just made me feel, and in a good way, that, yeah, this is Fate. This is what I'm here for, and this is why I keep reading and playing these games.